everyone, and welcome to the California Department of Education's Literacy Knowledge Building video series. In this video, we will learn about the purpose and best practices of interventions in coaching. For this video, be sure to download the handouts located on California Educators Together. The Literacy Knowledge Building video series is a series of videos on critical topics in literacy birth through grade 12. It was developed by the California Department of Education and literacy experts from the state literacy team, and it is complementary to the work of the Federal Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grants. You can learn more about this grant by going to https://www.cde.ca.gov/pd/ps/clsd.asp. This video series is intended to provide guidance and resources on critical topics in literacy, to support the work of the CLSD grants, and to build coherence between California's literacy guidance documents, standards, and frameworks and how they all support literacy. A primary objective of the CLSD grant is to bring coherence between California's guiding documents, some of which you see here, like the Preschool Learning Foundations, the Infant Toddler Learning and Development Foundations, the Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, the Dyslexia Guidelines, and the English Learner Roadmap Policy. Other content area standards and frameworks support literacy as well. The videos produced in this series will illustrate the connections between all of these documents and also explain how the documents themselves support literacy development for our students. Videos will be produced over the course of the CLSD grant period. To be informed when new videos are posted, join the CLSD listserv by sending a blank email to join-cde-literacy@mlist.cde.ca.gov. And now I will turn it over to our presenters.
Welcome to the video on interventions in coaching, purpose and best practices. This video will be brought to you by the following people listed on this slide: Lucy Pearson Edwards, Director of Continuous Improvement and Academic Support; Mindy Montano, English teacher on special assignment; Nancy Cushion White, Clinical Professor of Pediatrics; and Nancy Rogers Ziguera, Editor of the California Reader and Teacher Leader. Each of us is bringing varying perspectives and experience to thinking in this presentation. This presentation is based on resources on the CDE website and in the English Language Arts, English Language Development, ELA/ELD framework. The outline for this presentation is in 3 parts. Section 1 is the use of assessments to inform intervention decisions and purposes of interventions. Section 2 is how to use data as a coach. We will be role-playing a coaching conversation, specifically addressing what questions to ask when holding a data conversation and how to put students into intervention groups. Section 3 will focus on what coaches can do to foster progress monitoring, observation, model lessons, and checkpoints. School teams are encouraged to stop the video at any time and discuss the ideas presented. There will be several pause and ponder points where it is highly recommended that viewers stop the video and read handout materials and/or apply the information to their classroom or school data. Our learning targets for all sections of the videos: to establish purpose of assessment, establish purpose of interventions, review key ideas about using assessment cycles to form intervention groups, model a coaching session, establish best practices for grouping students, review best practices for implementation of progress monitoring.
Welcome. Today we're going to be working on section 2 of coaching and intervention. And our session today will answer these questions. How might coaches use data to foster conversations with teachers to improve student learning? So we'll be looking at the types of questions to ask, the types of data sets to use for looking at your early learners, and what does the data reveal? Also, we'll be placing students in correct intervention groups based on intensity. So we'd like to start off this by saying that with our first part of high-performing schools use data, so they use data-driven decision-making to help them plan and teach using best practices. So we'd like to start off with a quote by Stephen White. And he says, quote, "The value of the data emerges only when analysis provides insights that direct decisions for students." So today we're going to be using a data set and we'll be analyzing it to help the new teacher, Miss M, make some decisions about her students in order to form these intervention groups. And we'll be modeling a coaching conversation as an ongoing progress monitoring type of thing for her in her school. And we'll be looking at baseline data. So today's questions: how do we currently identify children who are not learning as quickly as others? And how can we form intervention groups to address student needs? So as we said, high-performing schools, research shows that they use the data-informed decision-making cycle. And I'm going to read through the cycle now for you. The first step in box 1 on the right-hand side is framing issues, asking the right questions. The next step is data collection, and then data analysis. Sometimes these are recursive and you go back and forth, but we'll be looking at data collection, box 2, data analysis, box 3. Then after we collect that data, we're going to interpret the data and see what the data reveals to us. And then based on that data collection, analysis, and interpretation, we'll be making some decisions about forming groups in order for Miss M to start teaching her first grade students. So then she will look at progress monitoring, and that'll really be in the next part of the coaching cycle. So starting out, looking at a quote from the ELA/ELD framework, chapter 8, page 837, using baseline data as a school coach to frame conversations. So it's always good to go back to your framework, and there's a whole chapter on coaching. But we took out this quote: "Results from interim assessments provide periodic snapshots of student learning throughout the year. These snapshots help teachers monitor how student learning is progressing and determine who is on track to meet the standards by the end of the year and who is not, which may mean that a student is in need of additional support." So our conversation today is going to look at that baseline data and help Miss M determine who needs a little more support in her regular classroom as a tier 1 intervention to help them meet their learning target. So right now, we'd like you to stop the video, but we have some things for you to read to get a little more background information on what we're going to do today. So we'd like you to read the coaching intervention vignette, which is handout 1, which will tell you a little bit about the school, the demographics, and about Miss M as a new teacher and her class. Then we'd like you to step 2, review the data set. And these are in handouts 2 and 3. And this gives you a sample classroom of first graders and what they might be scoring. So this is the sample that we're going to be using to talk through our data conversations. And then the next handout will be in 2 parts. There's the Notice and Wonder protocol sheet. There's one for you. And then there'll be some filled out ones, which will give you information about a sample. So take a moment to read the Coaching for Intervention vignette, review the data set to set the stage for this coaching conversation, and try to complete the Notice and Wonder sheet if you can before you come back. So you're back, and a recap from the vignette. Each first grade teacher gave several early literacy assessments: letter ID, concepts about print, sight word recognition, hearing and recording sounds and word, and text level reading. And every student in the class was given this to get a full picture of the skills they need as emergent readers. So we can really see what their strengths are, what they control, and what they might need additional support with. we're going to now try to model the coaching conversation with Miss M, a first grade teacher who's a new teacher. And the coaching meeting with her, the purpose is for using data to think through new ideas, discuss best instructional practices to reinforce and strengthen our teaching. And this would be an ongoing collaborative conversation that you would have with the coach and the teacher. And I would go through the entire first grade team and do a similar process with them. Okay, so we are going to review the steps for the data-informed decision-making cycle. Our first step, which we're going to address shortly, framing issues, asking the right questions, which leads to data collection, collecting the right data, data analysis, looking at that data more deeply, data interpretation, figuring out what it really means and what it reveals, and decision-making, forming groups to start the teaching, which will be followed up with ongoing progress monitoring. So we're going to start with framing the issues, asking the right questions. So let's look at that, framing the issues, asking the right questions. So some questions that we might ask, I would ask Miss M now to join our conversation, and she's going to talk about what she's interested in finding out about. Miss M?
Sure, thank you. So when I looked at my data, I wanted it to uncover or reveal which students need the most support in my class, and also how I can work on my instruction as well.
Great. All right. And now can you tell me what assessments you've given to assess the baseline information on your students' early literacy skills?
Sure. So my team and I decided to give 6 subtests to see where our students were at. We gave them a text level reading, passage reading test, letter identification, concepts about print, hearing and recording sounds and words, writing vocabulary, and sight word recognition.
No, that's great. That'll really give you an idea of the foundational skills that students need in order to put all that together and read continuous text. So you've got a lot of good information there. Now, what did you notice when you reviewed the data set? We're going to talk about that coming up. And then we'll be looking at first what are the grade level expectations at this time. And we'll be looking at how many students are meeting those expectations. So I know the district has learning targets. So let's look, before we really dig into that data set, let's look at those grade level expectations at this time, or our learning targets. So here are our district sample learning targets. Have you had a chance to review them, Miss M?
Yes, my team and I looked at these before we gave our assessments. Would
Oh,
you like me to talk through them?
Yeah, I'd like you to just highlight for us those August learning targets, because that's where we're starting with our baseline data.
Yes, so that first assessment letter ID, we're looking at scores of between 48 and 49 to set our baseline.
So in kindergarten,
Mhm.
you know, these are entering first graders. So that's something good to look for, good, strong letter ID knowledge. Okay.
Mhm. And our reading record, I believe this is like our text level reading passages. We're looking for an entry score of 3 or 4 for our first graders.
So we can see if they're really looking at text and being able to process as they go along. Okay.
Yes. Our high frequency word list. So for first grade, we're looking at 25.
Okay. And then that's great too. So they have that quick recognition of sight words.
Hearing and recording sounds and words. We're looking at 9 to 15 out of 37 of the phonemes.
So they can also hear the sounds, and then they can attach the symbol to the sound.
And then word writing, we're looking for 7 to 9 words.
So those are words they can write on their own quickly, that they have under control.
And then our last one is concepts about print. So we're looking for a score of 8 to 10 out of 24.
So they know if they have one-to-one matching, and if they know the first and last and return sweep, all those beginning concepts that you need to know to read. Okay. We know that learning to read and write is a complex process and requires the use of many sources of information used together to read continuous text. So we'll be looking at your students to see if they can take all this item knowledge and put it together. And these learning targets are really here to help guide our instruction and see what children control and what they need to learn. So we can use that as you look at your student data to compare them and see what you need to teach. And looking forward to November, we have some other targets. So we see that they have small increments of learning as you go along when you give your next benchmark assessment or use that progress monitoring to see you've been teaching hard. Let's see what the kids can do on their own. So let's look at those November targets so you can be thinking where your students are now and then what they need to do by that first trimester.
Yes, absolutely. So we're looking at using our intervention groups so that students will grow from August, and then when we look at their assessment data in November and December. So we can see in that second column for November and December, letter ID, we hope increases to 50 to 51. Reading record, we're hoping that we can increase the score from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. Our high frequency word list, or BA, first grade, first half. Hearing and recording sounds and words, we're looking for them to increase 23 to 27 out of 37 phonemes. Word writing, we're hoping they increase to 15 to 20 words that they can write on their own. And then concepts about print, we're hoping that they can score 15 to 16 out of 24 on that.
So they can, with that, they can really look at looking across a word, and they can see the beginning of the word, the middle of the word, and the end of the word. And they know a lot more about reading and how it works.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So we know where we are and where we're going.
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to start our coaching meeting. We already talked a little bit about it, but let's talk about our goals for our coaching meeting today. Ms. M, I always like to set some goals for our meeting so we can get through and come out with a good outcome. So we've talked about these norms before, and we've set our norms for the meeting, and they were in that vignette. So we're looking at no judgments and no blaming, and we're going to really focus on that problem solving and focus on the results for the students and some goals so you know where you want to head with those students. And then we want to consider a lot of possibilities. So we want to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the children. And then of course, this whole thing is going to be confidential. So we're just talking together and collaborating and brainstorming to figure out what to do. So we're going to also analyze that baseline early literacy data. And then through that, we'll reveal the students' strengths and weaknesses based on the data, and then form intervention groups for you based on the intensity of need. So you'll be looking at your students and forming several groups by the end of our conversation. Does that sound like some good goals for you?
Sounds terrific. It's exactly what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation today.
Great. I think we can get all that accomplished today. So we're going to start back with our data-informed decision-making cycle, which you know well. And we've framed the questions. And so now, from box 1, we were framing those issues and asking the questions. We know the issues that some of her students, there's a wide range of data for her students. So we're going to ask those questions to figure out what that range is. Now we're going to collect that data and really analyze it. Once we get that data, then we're going to really analyze it in box 3. And in box 4, do a little more data interpretation, and then look at that interpretation to help us with our teaching decisions, making and forming groups. And we're going to have you set up so you can start teaching. And then figure out if you need to move kids back and forth in groups with flexible grouping based on your progress monitoring. So we're going to focus now on data collection. So in handout 2, what assessments have you given to assess the baseline information on your students' early literacy skills? So we've just taken a snippet here for the data collection, and triangulation of data is important. And what I mean by that is you have to use several subtests to see all the skills that students need as emerging readers to really read and process the text. So to get a full picture of what an emergent reader uses while reading, look at the data from each subtest to see what the child's strength is and what the child needs to learn next. So can you highlight that for us, Miss M? What do you see there in a snippet of your students' data?
Sure, we've highlighted the students who have taken my tests. So we're looking at the 6 different subtests that we've given. We're looking at Brianna's data, Jacob, Olivia, Jalen, and Letitia. And we can see across the chart how they've scored on each test. So for example, in text level reading, Brianna scored a 1A, Jacob scored a 2B, Olivia scored 3, Jalen was a 5D, and Letitia scored a 1AA. Under letter identification, Brianna scored 52, Jacob scored 52, Olivia scored 52, Jalen scored 53, and Letitia scored 50. On concepts about print, Brianna scored a 10, as did Jacob. Olivia scored a 12, Jalen scored 14, and Letitia scored 10. On hearing and recording sounds and words, Brianna scored 18, Jacob scored a 17, Olivia scored 18, Jalen scored 22, and Letitia scored 18. On writing vocabulary, Brianna scored 11, Jacob scored 12, Olivia 13, Jalen 20, Letitia 12. And on sight word recognition, out of 20, Brianna scored a 5, Jacob a 6, Olivia 8, Jalen 10, and Letitia 4.
All right. So we can see a wide range in just looking at those 5 students to give a snapshot of your class. All right. So now Miss M is going to use the Notice and Wonder protocol, and you have a handout for that. And she's going to take about 5 to 10 minutes to notice and really dig into that data using handout number 2. And she's going to write 3 to 4 notice statements about what you see in the results of the assessment. And if you would remember that these are factual observations of what is present in the data, not what's missing, but what do you actually see from the results. And then each statement starts with the phrase, I noticed that. And then you'll be sharing out those notice statements. And maybe you might have some wondering as you go too. If you want, you could add those. But take a few minutes to really look at that data and what do you notice? Thanks for coming back. We see that we have handout 4A with some of your, what did you notice? And I say also you already started wondering, that's great. So you're thinking ahead to that problem solving. Good. Would you like to share your, what did you notice about the data?
Sure. After looking at all of my students' scores on their subtests in handout 2, I noticed that 13 students scored a 4 or higher on the text level reading. So they were at baseline or above. I noticed that 11 students scored below the baseline of 4 on the text level reading. I was looking for strengths, so I noticed something positive, that many students had high scores in letter identification. I also noticed that students were strong in hearing and recording sounds and words. And then my last notice is kind of a wonder at the same time, but it does seem like there was a lot of good instruction in kindergarten, despite being on distance learning for most of the year. But I guess this is more of a wonder, maybe that students aren't applying the skills when reading longer or more continuous texts. Shall I
Right.
continue with my wonders?
Well, yeah, that's, I like how you've uncovered a lot. So you've already looked at your student data of 24 in your class, and you can see that you have about half that are meeting that learning target coming into first grade. But then you have about half that are probably you're going to put in your intervention groups,
Mhm.
because that's what you wanted to know. So we're going to look a little more deeply as you wonder. I'm going to help you look a little bit more deeply at those 11 children about what you can do to support them. And we know that they were on remote learning most of the time. And so we just want to give them an extra boost and a lot of support to get them going so they can meet that November target. And you're right, they came in with a lot of item knowledge, high item
Mhm.
knowledge. So a lot was going on in kindergarten. How about some of those wonderings?
Sure. So my wonders are definitely tied to what I observed in my data. I wonder how I can most effectively group students into intervention groups. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today. I wonder what strategies would be most effective to implement first. What could I start with? And then lastly, I wonder how I can raise the integration of skills in text level reading.
Okay, well, I think we'll be able to talk through a lot of those issues, and hopefully I'll have some good answers to that throughout our conversation. So we're going to look at one example for collecting data that we're going to dig a little bit deeper. Most of you know how to do letter ID and those other sorts of tests, but we're going to look at text level reading. Perhaps your district uses a text level reading placement screener. And we'd like you to listen to the student read an actual passage of text that should be where they might be. And you're going to circle the errors. And step 4 is you're going to note the reading behaviors. And what I mean by that is you're going to look for those strategic behaviors. Are they monitoring? Do they notice there's an error? Can they notice an error and self-correct, go back and fix it up? Or do they just keep on reading? Do they also reread to help them confirm what they're reading? And what kind of problem solving do they have when they come up to a point of difficulty? Are they able to try different things to solve that word? And of course, we're also looking for reading fluently and phrasing. And we're going to look at all these. We're going to be the keen observers to really see what's going on. Aside from that score, we're looking at what the child actually does. So after we note that, we are going to use the evaluation rubric that probably comes with the screener to place the student at a level. You might have to go up or down that passage to get the right place for them. And then to help with a little bit more information, you're going to take a Post-it note. You're going to write the student's name on a Post-it note and list the reading behaviors and strategic processing that you see for each student. So you can see over in the corner, there's a picture of a file folder. This is really quick. You just put the name of the student on, the text level they have, but you're going to also note some of the things they did while reading so you can determine what intervention group to put the kids in. And then you just group the students together so you can see you've got your reading groups tentatively formed right there to help you. One way to look at their text level reading. So we're not going to go through all of the handout, but on handout 3, there's a way for you to look through your data quickly, and you're going to list the lowest scoring 5 children in each subtest. So you put the lowest as number 1. And if there's a tie, you're going to list the students who tied. So you're using the data to identify and group students for the intervention by name, and you're going to use handout 2 and 3. So would you like to tell us what you see there when you actually put the students in looking at that text level reading?
Sure. So in this first test, these were the students that I noticed had scored the lowest on their tests. So my first student was Letitia, who scored a 1 AA. She had 91% accuracy and 1 self-correction. Kylie was my next student, who also scored a 1 AA, or pre-primer, I guess, with a 93% accuracy and 1 self-correction. My next student was Brianna, who scored a 1A with 91% accuracy and 2 self-corrections. And then Mateo, who also scored a 1A, had 92% accuracy with 0 self-corrections. And my last student listed was Jonathan, who scored a 1A with 95% accuracy with 0 self-corrections.
Okay, so thanks for reading those out for us. And what we want to think about is thinking of that strategic behavior. We want to think about, why is this self-correction important? So the child who knows how to look at print can find errors and fix mistakes using multiple sources of information. That's why we're really interested not only in the accuracy, but we want to see what they do on the text. Are they really looking at it? And can they really help themselves and fix things up? So as you said, we on that form on the back side, using data to identify and group students for intervention by name and intensity, on handout 3 on the last page, you can see that the grouping students for the intervention group. Do you want to read what you did, Miss M?
Sure. So in the last slide that we talked about, we only looked at a little bit of the data of one of the 6 subtests. But when I started looking through all of their data and putting them in order, I wanted to list the number, list the students by the total number of appearances in the subtask lists above. So my first student was Mateo, who showed up 5 times. So he's my number 1 student for intervention. My next student was Jonathan, who also showed up 5 times. Then Kylie, who showed up 4 times. Letitia showed up 3 times. And then I had a tie between Brianna and David, who both showed up 2 times.
So great, you wondered about that tie. So let's think about Brianna and David. And one of the ways we can get a little more information is to go back to those Post-it notes. Let's go to their Post-it note and see what kind of processing they're doing to see if we can make a determination on who might benefit from the most intensive intervention group. So here we're looking at data analysis and interpretation a little bit by going to look at those Post-its. So go ahead, Miss M, and tell us what you wrote down on that Post-it for Brianna and David.
Sure. So I was really grateful to have this strategy to use with along with my hard data from my tests. But I did notice some reading behaviors and I put them on our Post-its. So for Brianna, I had noticed she self-corrected twice on the passage. So like you said, it really showed that she had those problem-solving skills as she was reading. She went back and reread things. She sounded really fluent, very smooth reading, and she could answer the comprehension questions at the end of the passage.
So she has a lot going on.
And
yes. That's great that you could capture it with your observations on that Post-it so you could remember.
Yes. And so with David, I did notice that he did not self-correct at all. He had 0 self-corrections. He did not reread any of the passage, and he sounded really choppy, just really not a fluent reader orally. And he could not answer any comprehension questions at the end of the passage.
Okay, so that gives us some information. Even though David scored higher on the text, he probably had really good oral language in it, and based on that not self-correcting, do you think he was really looking at the text?
I don't think so. I think he was just kind of reading through it without taking the time to think through and carefully read.
Yeah, he didn't seem to monitor or notice any errors or go back. And we can tell he didn't understand it. So what do you think, based on looking at those Post-its and their problem solving, where would you place those 2 students?
Like, I was glad to have this activity because I think I'm going to put David in that first group. Even though he did have higher accuracy on the passage reading, his reading behaviors lead me to want to put him in that first intervention group.
Yeah, I think that's a smart move because you can really teach him how to monitor and how to fix up by really looking at the text. And so he'll be and really thinking about the meaning of the story so he can comprehend what he's reading to early on. So then he can accelerate as we go through the year. And you can always, with your progress monitoring, these are flexible groups. So
Mhm.
if for some reason he didn't show you what he can really do, you could always change him into a different group.
Yes.
Yeah. So we see that David is going to be put in that intervention group.
Yes.
We're looking at data interpretation now. And as we look at the data interpretation and grouping students for intervention, it's good to think through who we really have based on looking at all those subtests. So some of the coaching questions that I had for you, because we started with that as our goal at the beginning. We have the names of the students that need intervention now, but what patterns do you see in the data as you look across your class?
Yes. Students were good at making sound symbol correspondence, but they weren't using it on the text. And half of my class is still reading at levels 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, so you notice that they came in with strong letter ID and they also could, they had really pretty high hearing and recording sounds and words. So that means they're starting to put the sounds together with the symbols. But for whatever reason, they probably didn't have enough practice reading in kindergarten. So they're still not able to use all that great information when they read continuous text. So based on that, with that group, what type and intensity of intervention do you think they need?
Well, I formed classroom tier 1 groups with the 3 groups, my level 1 through 3 readers. I'm going to monitor those groups closely to see if my small group interventions will work. Planning on giving them many opportunities with close reading, problem solving, like those reading behaviors where they can self-correct, and possibly increase the amount of writing that they'll be doing in those intervention groups.
Right. So lots of kids learn to read through writing. There's a real reciprocal processing that goes on with reading and writing. I'm glad you're going to work on that because that's something that'll really propel their learning. So we're going to recap the cycle again. So we talked about box 1, framing issues, asking the right question. Box 2, data collection. Now we're in box 3, data analysis, and we've been looking at that data analysis, and going to box 4, data interpretation, which we are doing now with our conversation. Coming up will be decision making and forming those groups to start teaching, and using progress monitoring all the time to keep our groups right where the children need to be to reach their learning targets. So I'd like you've made a lot of good things that you noticed and things that you're wondering about, things you want to start teaching based on your data, where you're really using that data to inform your thinking and guiding what we're going to do. So I'd like you to take another look and use a second notice and wonder protocol to help you dig a little bit deeper. So again, I'd like you to wonder now a little bit more. And if you notice anything, that's great too. Wonder for 5 to 10 minutes. And Miss M is going to write down some more wonder statements. And then number 2, these comments will offer some possible suggestions or post questions for the teacher and for me as the coach to think about what they need to strengthen her work and to really address the needs of the students. So her statements are going to begin with, I wonder. And then she's going to share them out so we can talk about them and plan for her getting started with her instruction. So thanks for filling out that second notice and wonder handout for B. Would you like to share what some of your noticings and wonders? I see you put in some noticings too. That's great. Thank you.
Yes. So I went back and I looked through my data and I looked through my groups. And I did have a couple of notices and I wanted to bring those up. So my first notice was that even though student scores were similar, their reading behaviors showed differences that would place them into different groups. So it was really good for me to look at those Post-it notes to see where Brianna and David differed. I think that really helped me a lot. And I also noticed that I do have groups that are going to be very similar to each other, but as you mentioned, these groups are fluid and I'll be monitoring them to make sure that students are placed appropriately.
Mhm. Yeah, so you do have about 11 students that are going to need that intensive intervention since they were came in a little bit below the learning targets for our district.
Mhm.
So let's look at some of your wonderings.
Yeah. So it's been on my mind a lot, but since we've been in the pandemic and we've pivoted to remote or distance learning, I realize other teachers, especially our kindergarten teachers, had to do this as well. So I wonder if students may not have had enough time to read longer text passages. They were really good at doing certain things on the subtests, but it seemed that in those longer passages with the continuous reading, um, did they not have enough time or exposure to those longer texts? I also wonder how often I am going to need to monitor and rearrange my intervention groups. That might be something you can help me with. And then my last wonder is if I can implement some additional assessments in writing and begin some writing intervention groups.
Yeah, those are great wonderings. I think you're probably right that it was hard for kids to really read a lot of text in kindergarten. It was easier to do things like letter ID and hearing sounds and putting them together. So, and I agree with the writing. I think the writing was the hardest thing to do remotely. And so they could have this isolated item knowledge and they came in with a lot of it, but they didn't really have a chance to orchestrate and put all those great skills together when they have to read text together. So I think in your intervention group, you can start there with helping them know how to find errors and self-correct. And then I think that ongoing monitoring, like taking a reading record periodically, is going to really help you to know who's taking it on. And maybe you'll have to move kids back and forth, but it's great to have maybe two groups so you can reassess periodically within that, your 6 or 8 week cycle and see how you can help those students. And I really think addressing the writing early on is going to help them put together because they can compose messages and then really learn how to put everything together and reread their own text, which is going to help them understand what they need to do to monitor and problem solve. So great noticings and wondering. I hope that's helping you think what you're going to do to start teaching.
It really is. Thank you for all of this help.
Yeah, I think you know where to go by looking at those subtests and the learning targets. So you can start teaching those things that they need to fill in to get up to that learning target and then move forward toward November. So as we recap that data analysis and interpretation, I just captured some of the notice and wonderings that Ms. M shared with us after she looked a second time in her data. And I asked a couple of clarifying questions, especially about the text level reading and the strategic processing used by the student. And those Post-it notes really helped her figure out who she should put in the groups initially. And then by looking at the 6 subtests, she really had used triangulation of data, and she looked at a lot of subtests so she can meet the needs of the students more effectively by having more data. And so she was able to see which students were performing in relationship to the various learning targets. And she can go back and start teaching hard for some of those things that they're lower in. And she was also able to figure out the number of higher scoring students. She had some students that scored at a level 10 coming in, so they've got a lot going on. And then she knew which ones to put in the mid-scoring students. And we also answered the question, the lower scoring students. And so you figured out for yourself, looking at through the data, what those groups might look like. And then you figured out what students are in need of the intervention and a small group instruction and what type of intensity. So it was a good there's a recap of what we just did through the process of the conversation and looking at the data. So we're going to go to our very last step. So remember, in the data-informed decision-making cycle, we go through the cycle and talk about each thing each time. So we started with framing the issues and asking questions. And Miss M had a lot of great questions that she wanted to find out about her data. Then she collected the data using 6 subtests. She analyzed that data, trying to look at which ones were meeting learning targets and which ones weren't. She interpreted that data. She had to go in and look a little bit more closely and compare and contrast and see who might benefit most from the most intensive interpretation. And now she's formed her groups and she's going to start teaching. And then she's going to use that progress monitoring, ongoing daily progress monitoring, to see where kids are working and what she needs to add in. So recapping that decision-making, that last step, forming groups and where to start teaching, we just helped her capture those decisions that were made and think about where she needs to start for the most intense intervention. And Miss M, how is the intense performing group in the relation to the learning targets? You think you know who they are, and you think you're ready to go on that?
I do. I think I made a good decision about the students who I've placed into those intervention groups. I believe that they will benefit from that intense intervention.
Mm-hmm. And now you might want to set some goals for the students to reach each learning target. So do you think you could look at those specific learning targets in relationship to each student?
Yes, I have that baseline data, those learning targets that we did from August, and then in November and December, I'll be able to, hopefully the students will have made some progress towards those at that point.
Oh, I'm sure they will. You're going to be teaching hard, and you know what you're going for. So I think those students will meet those new targets. And you know where to start teaching with some of the things to start that intensive intervention group?
Yes, I do. And I have my team that can help me out as well.
Right. And so I'll be coming back again, and we'll be talking about how it's going as we go through this coaching cycle again. So I'd like you to keep thinking about what you notice about the students and what you're wondering. So when we have our next conversation, we can go through this process again. I hope the notice and wonder was a good way for you to think it through.
It really was. It allowed me to see the facts in the assessments, to see the data. And it also gave me the opportunity to kind of think outside the box a little bit with what I wondered.
So good. So we had a good, productive meeting, and I think we met the goals of our meeting that we set forward. And again, this is all confidential, and hopefully will help you use best practice and data to inform your teaching of your intervention groups and all your students. So now it's your turn to pause and ponder. And we'd like you to go through the same cycle. So we'd like you to explore your assessments and cut points or learning targets for your grade level at your school or district, and use those to collect baseline early literacy data during the first weeks of school. It's really important to start right in August or September and get those so you can start teaching where the students really need to be, and knowing where they need to be. And because of the remote learning, it is more than, it's very necessary that we look at where everyone is so we know where to start and move forward. So collect your student data and review the data as a next step. And then try to apply the notice and wonder protocol, and that handout we provided for you. So walk through that and think about what do you notice about the student performance. Are there some students underperforming? Are there students that are above performing? And then really to identify by name the students who need additional support and to think about the level of intensity of support. So do they need, group instruction, additional support every day? Maybe more than one support. So be thinking about that as you look through your own data. So we hope this process is useful for you thinking through your data and making informed decisions on the data. So thank you so much for joining us today in our coaching conversation and looking at the data to inform our teaching and practice. And we'd like to have you continue to deepen your learning and continue by joining and looking at the next video about interventions and coaching in section 3 of this series. In section 3, a preview, section 3 covers what coaches can do to foster progress monitoring, what coaches can do when the observation, model lessons, and checkpoints. So thanks again for joining us. I hope you got some good takeaways, and I hope that section 3 also deepens your learning. Thanks.
Thank you for viewing this video on interventions and coaching. Watch section 3 in this series to continue your learning. And make sure to watch the other videos in this series, which you can access by going to the CDE website and searching for CLSD.